McCown a question about best practices and what his opinion was on best practices, best industry practices being used to build this pipeline. And more specifically, I wanted to know, will someone be able to come back, after the pipeline is built a year later, 2 years later, and say, well, actually, this could have been done to make the pipeline safer, whether and even industry agreeing to that to a certain extent. I know that with some of the environmental issues that we've had in the North Texas area, not just with oil and gas, but others, like take, for instance, flaring. Someone will say, well, it's too expensive to pipeline the gas out, and so so we'll just flare it. We know environmentally that flaring is not the best thing to do, but sometimes it's just done for efficiency and for maximizing profit. So are the very best practices being used as it relates to the environment and the safety of this pipeline?
That's a very good question, and yes, they are, and I share your concern. I've been a planning and zoning commissioner in North Texas where I voted against pipelines. It didn't seem to make sense in places. But yes, the 57 special conditions that TransCanada has come up with, they did that before the passage of the last Pipeline Safety Improvement Bill. And a lot of the things that are in here are now law. So they were cutting edge ahead of the law. I think the key component is to make sure that the regulator not only holds them to the highest standard, but requires continual refinement of that process. As technology includes, if you look at cars 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have airbags, we didn't have different things. As technology increases, then we hold the entire infrastructure system accountable as well. But the question isn't, should we build the pipeline? The question is, this will be the state-of-the-art as we have today, far exceeding anything else that is out there, and that makes it safer.
Mr. Swift, what is your opinion on the best practices and this being the safest possible pipeline to move crude?
Well, we heard the same language used with regard to Keystone 1 and TransCanada's natural gas Bison pipeline, both constructed in 2010, both with special conditions. Both said they were state-of-the-art and would unlikely to spill in the first 30 or 40 years. And with Keystone 1, we saw 14 spills in the first year, and with the Bison pipeline, a 60-foot section of it exploded. Now, TransCanada was recently put under a sweeping review by Canadian regulators for what one whistleblower, who was a quality control personnel, claims to be systematic violation of minimum safety standards in the building of pipelines. So, on one hand, we have questions of will they use the best methods available, and will the specs be the best available? And the second is, will they build to spec? And both of these issues seem to be a problem with regard to TransCanada. And as a final note on these 57 conditions, as Brigham mentioned, as Mr. McCown mentioned, many of the special conditions are now minimum safety standards set by the 2012 pipeline safety law. Many of these special conditions are conditions that TransCanada was already required to abide by because of its Canadian sections. So while there's a large number of conditions, if you really look at which ones add any bar above what the current bar is, it's a much smaller list.
And I'd like for Mr. McCown to respond specifically to what Mr. Swift said about the specs.
Sure. Well, there's a lot of spin going on there, but the fact that the Canadian portion is built to whatever spec doesn't require the U.S. portion to be built to that same spec. Two, the PHMSA oversees the construction and the placement in service through its own inspections and through third-party validators, both that the company uses and PHMSA uses, so it is built to spec. Secondly, when I was at PHMSA, we moved the, quote, spill criteria down to basically anything more than 5 gallons. So when people say it was a spill, there's a big difference between a little spill and a big spill, and these numbers get thrown around like they're candy, and it's a little misleading, frankly.